Good morning and welcome to the Culture Hour here on Mountain Stream TV. Today I've with a guest who is involved in the theater work in our community, Kevin Norris, and very happy to have you with us today.
Nice to be here, Mr. Crowe.
Yes.
Appreciate your time.
Yes, so we're going to all get into some theater discussions this morning and talk about Kevin's history and his interests. This is the first time actually on the Culture Hour that we've had a guest with a theater background, so this will be interesting for us and also hopefully for you out there in Mountain Stream TV land. So, well, let's get started, Kevin. I mean, tell us a little bit about how you ended up in Western North Carolina and in Jackson County in particular, your background and history in that way.
Well, first of all, I'm honored to be here. Did you run out of real artists? No, just kidding there. I'm actually an Air Force brat, and we moved around all over the place and my dad settled down in the eastern end of the state, and I went to Appalachian State University and got a degree in history and minored in theater, and then was in the Army and got a master's at North Carolina State, and wow, I've been around all over the place. We settled here because my wife is a member of the Western Band of the Cherokee Nation, and she wanted to come and teach at Cherokee High School. I'm sorry, she was teaching at Cherokee Elementary, and I started teaching at Cherokee High School. So we came here to this end of the state because she had people here, and I was familiar with North Carolina, and it's a great state. Got my North Carolina tie on there. I taught at Cherokee High School for 10 years, and then moved over to Smoky Mountain when my sons were there.
So that brings us up to date. But I'm interested too, especially in terms of our theme this morning of theater. How early on did you get interested in acting and theater work, and what were some of the things that the aha moments that early on? I'm guessing probably it was fairly young for you.
That's true. My mother was very interested in Shakespeare, and when I was 4 or 5, I got put into what I trust was a very bad version of Richard III as one of the children. That was eventually executed in the Tower. Richard III is still a favorite of mine, but not for those reasons in particular. My mom and dad both read to us, and if you don't mind for just a second, I'm going to say hello and thank you to my dad, who's recovering from cancer, and we are extremely proud of the hard work that he's put in and how he got us to the place that he got us to, although I didn't get where I am today by trying to get where I am today. No, my dad and mom both read to us very early and very often, and convinced us that the written word was very useful to us in our lives, as well as the spoken word, and they always encouraged us to be creative and to use that as an outlet. And not surprisingly, especially in terms of ethical decisions and what we thought was right. So Mom and Dad very early convinced us that what we needed to do was be a voice, and that the theater provided one of those really effective ways to be that voice and to communicate what we thought was right to larger audiences than just some we were talking to.
Can you remember your first experiences on stage or in public in a dramatic situation?
Well, as I said, I do remember being thrust onto the stage in Shakespearean plays that I certainly didn't belong in at that point. My aha moment, though, I would have to say came after the birth of my sons. Especially in terms of theater. I went for a good 15 or 20 years without performing in the theater after I'd been doing it all my life up until that point. And when I did go back, one of the things that really intrigued me was how effective it was in terms of communicating even to a newer generation that was raised electronically, but still was very interested in the stage. And one of my proudest moments was when my son Quentin got to play Puck in a version that the Atlanta Shakespeare Company helped us put together over at Cherokee. I wrote a grant to the casino and another one to the state of North Carolina's Arts Council to get the money together to bring the Atlanta Shakespeare Company up here. And they worked with my students for a week, and we put together a green show, or a pantomime type version of Midsummer Night's Dream, and my son was in that as Puck, and then I got to play Philostrate with the Atlanta Shakespeare Company in productions that we did that weekend over there at Cherokee High School. And it was illuminating for me. I'd always seen theater as a really great way for expressing myself, but then to actually see that communicated to younger people who initially probably had never even seen a live theater performance, I was happy and proud, and I saw that it wasn't just for the actor, it was as much for the audience, that it was a method of communication that we shared, and that it wasn't just me talking to them, it was their responses to me as well.
So what kind of roles, maybe after that aha moment, have you've been in, and what kind of performances have you done in the last, 15, 20 years or something?
Well, lately, mostly I'm a member of the Montford Park Players. I'm really excited about working with them over in Asheville. It's free Shakespeare, and it's designed specifically to try to get more people in by taking down the barrier of cost. And so I've done a number of roles with Montford recently. I've also been involved in some other companies there in Asheville, like the Annam Carum Theater Company and Mountain Arts Theater. I got to play Eugene V. Debs in a recent version there at Annam Carum that a local playwright wrote. So I was thrilled to be acting in a local production and to be playing someone like Eugene V. Debs, a socialist from way back. Those of you who don't know, of course, your local viewers, the ones that are always watching, like George and Ethel over there on Old Cullowhee Road, would know that, but they're shut-ins. So.
Well, what you do for a day job is you're a teacher at Smoky Mountain High here in Silva, and one of your courses is acting for theater. Can you tell us a little bit about how that happened, and what your role is with students there, and what goes on, what kind of things result from your class, and the kinds of productions maybe that you're working on?
Oh, sure. I hate that this is turning into so much of a thank you show, but I really have to thank Linda Haggard. She's the musical theater director there at Smoky Mountain High School, and when I came over, she knew that I had started a theater program there at Cherokee High School, and she asked me if I would teach an acting class. We like to joke that she'd gotten to the point where she didn't want her musical theater students to just walk from point A to point B and start singing, and she wanted them to act as well. So we started it to be dovetailed with the musical theater program, and initially and still it basically focuses on the acting aspect for theater, the vocal and the body, and how that all becomes one in terms of a device to communicate with. And so Linda asked me if I would teach the course. We tried to see if enough students were interested. We got a great response, lots of students. In fact, now so much so that we had to split it up into 2 semesters. So I'll be teaching this semester and next semester as well. What I always try to communicate is that that it isn't just about acting, that acting is something we all do every day, and that the discipline, the order, the things that we get from acting in the theater we use in every aspect of our life. The ability to be able to listen carefully to someone, to be observant and notice things about them, these are all really important in terms of our interactions with human beings every day. And there's a lot of studies now that show that theater classes are useful in terms of emotional intelligence, and that they help develop empathy. And I know we all want people to be able to understand what other people are going through. So I see that aspect of it as most important, that we develop empathy in the students, and that they not only understand the place that other people are coming from, but can actually feel it themselves. Instead of just feeling sympathy for someone else, they actually feel what that other person is going through. And acting for theater helps develop that.
Will students in your class gradually become actors in plays performed at the high school? I mean, is that part of the reason for having the class, maybe?
Yes, sir. We, as a part of acting for theater, I don't just have them take multiple choice exams. Yeah, they still have to take those, but that's not the best way of measuring it. So what I have is a sort of expeditionary learning, in the sense that all their exams are performance exams. So we just finished up our midterms. That we did a Tennessee Williams one act called The Lady of Larkspur Lotion, and some other skits. We did that for the student body. We invited some classes in. We did that for them. But when they get to their final, they'll do a performance for the community, and we'll be doing Tuna Christmas this year. So anybody familiar with that wonderful little Tuna, Texas? We're going to be putting on a program there that comes from Tuna, Texas, a strange little imaginary town in Texas that they've got a phantom running around, and they need to figure out who that phantom is. So hope you'll all come out and see our version of Tuna Christmas.
Who are some of your favorite playwrights? I'm curious. You've done a lot of different kinds of theater, I know, and do you have any personal favorites that come to mind?
I'm a Sam Shepard fan. I love Sam Shepard's work as far as contemporary American. As they said in the Breakfast Club, Moliere really pumps my nads too. But I do like theater of the absurd. I'm a big Samuel Beckett fan. Endgame and Waiting for Godot were probably two of my favorites. But again, I would never consider putting on those kinds of performances, because the audience wouldn't be right for that here.
Right.
The theater of the absurd is just that, absurd, and it's usually aimed more towards theater people in terms of an audience. Mm-hmm. So the kinds of things that I like to read and that I like to see performed, we don't actually do at the high school. I want to make them available and able to do those things, but we think in terms of our good old rhetorical triangle, and we think about how an audience is going to respond to a particular play, and so that's why we pick something like Tuna, Texas, Tuna Christmas, because it is aimed toward an audience that doesn't have to understand those in-theater jokes like you would have to watching a Beckett play. That's aimed at everyday things that happen all the time around Christmas, and that it gets people to think about, again, those ideas that we think should be present all the time but aren't necessarily. How we treat other people, and why other people respond to us the way that they do.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever heard of a writer and who was also a playwright named Yvonne Gall? Well, okay.
I learned something today. Good.
Well, we can talk later, but no, Yvonne Gall was the originator of theater of the absurd. He doesn't get credit for it. He wrote a play called Methuselah when he was part of the German Expressionist movement in Germany back in the early part of the last century. And he was the model for people like Beckett and Ionesco and some of those people. And so we'll talk more about that.
That's great. Cut that part, okay? And people knowing I had no idea who that was.
But anyway, well, Yvonne Gall is one of my favorite poets, but it just turns out that he did a lot of things. He was the first person to translate Joyce's Ulysses, all kinds of stuff. I mean, he's one of the best kept secrets in modern American literature, or modern international canon and stuff. So we'll talk a little bit later about that. But so your experience has been in many different types of theater. I mean, you've explored comedy and satire and serious theater. Tell us a little bit about your Shakespeare experience, because this is something everybody at least has a little bit of knowledge of, or has heard the name.
True. Well, most recently, as I said, I'm a member of the Montfort Park Players. I had the privilege of playing Gremio in The Taming of the Shrew just this last summer. I've done Sebastian in The Tempest, and the Provost in Measure for Measure. I guess that would be very exciting to most people just to hear those things. You want me to do Richard?
Yeah.
I can do Richard III.
Do a little bit for us, so we have an idea what we're doing.
It's actually a favorite for some of my classes, because one of the things that I like to do with Richard III is emphasize the how the physical embodies some of the symbolic things that Shakespeare likes to do. So even though historically Richard wasn't probably as deformed as Shakespeare makes him out to be, we've got a hunchbacked, despicable character in Richard. And what we get most from Richard is not just that attitude, but he talks to the audience. Now we're familiar with an idea called the fourth wall, and we think in terms of a realism that has three walls and then an imaginary fourth wall between the audience and the actor. But that wasn't the case in original practice Shakespearean productions. And so Richard came on stage and immediately starts talking to the audience and tells them what he's going to do. And then after he's done it, he says, "Look, don't you think that was interesting? Now watch what I'm going to do." And he does some pretty horrible things to people. So I always like to come out to my class and talk to him like Richard from the very start. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by the sun of York. Now are the clouds lowered upon this house in brief agony. How is it that something like this would occur to us here in England? Now are our brows bound up in victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up as monuments, our stern alarums changed in merry meetings. Grim-visaged war hath smoothed his wrinkled front, and now, instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber, to the lascivious pleasings of a lute. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking-glass, I that am deceived of fortune and treated like this, I cannot be a hero. So I choose to be a villain, and I will get my revenge upon these people of England. I dropped some of that and paraphrased it. Sorry. Can we cut that? No.
No. It's there for posterity, I'm afraid.
Oh, no. Okay, well, Montfort Park people, you know I was faking it there.
But, okay, so that's serious drama, what is considered serious theater and drama. And how about comedy? Or maybe I should ask, do you have a preference? Do you like to do the lighter stuff? Do you like to do the serious stuff? It
is really interesting that you bring that up, especially at that point, because one of the things that I try to get across to them in terms of doing the difference between Richard and doing something like Taming of the Shrew would be that comedy is aimed at and is about community. So if you look at the titles of plays like Richard III, you can see that it's not just one play is funny and one play is tragic. If you look at something like Richard III or Julius Caesar or Othello, you see that the title tells you This is about an individual. And that individual considers himself so different from the rest of the community that that's what becomes tragic. In comedies like Measure for Measure, and well, that's kind of a problem play for some people, but Taming of the Shrew, what we're actually looking at is that it's told from the point of the view of the community. And so what we eventually come back to is there's always some sort of marriage, or there's always something at the end there that that brings the community back together. The antagonist is usually some older couple or someone trying to keep the younger couple from being happy, but it all ends in this community-oriented marriage or some sort of bringing together of the community at the end. So if I were going to do something comedic, then I would say it would have to be a dialogue between the two of you. Because yes, there are comedic monologues, but in terms of illustrating Shakespeare and comedy, the best comedic moments, as far as I'm concerned, are those exchanges between characters that show the isolation of one from the community or that bring them back together into the fold. In terms of acting, I like comedy better. In terms of trying to teach people to act, comedy's a lot more difficult than tragedy is. Tragedy, people expect that they're going to sit there and be sad, but in comedy, you've got to make them laugh. You've got to get them to see the same things that are funny that you thought were funny. And you know the old joke. They say, "What's the most important thing about comedy? Timing." Wait for them to start to answer it. Jump on it. Timing. And so what becomes funny to us is that that distinction between basically that situational irony of what we expect and what we actually get.
Have you ever done any stand-up comedy?
Aside from my classroom, no. I like to think of that in the same way sometimes, but no, never done anything like that. I've got a colleague, and again, thanks for watching my class for a little while there, Mr. Alexander, who's gone and done some of the storytelling at the Mothlight there in Asheville. They do that moth storytelling stuff, and he's gone and said it felt to him like like doing stand-up comedy, and in that respect is a lot like I would assume like what happens in our classrooms. I try to make it much more interactive than that, but it doesn't always end up that way. Did it this morning, first period.
Just in terms of a contrast, I mean, between Richard III and something that would be a little lighter, do you have something that you could share with us, a dramatic presentation on a more comedic side of things? It doesn't have to be from Shakespeare, it can be anything, but I'm just wondering if you can pull anything out of the hat.
That actually is probably an area that I need to work on, because I can't really think of anything right offhand that, except for maybe like a poem like Billy Collins's "Forgetfulness."
Sure. I mean, anything that you can think of is fine. Or if you don't.
Hopefully I'll remember all of it and not butcher it like I did Richard III's opening monologue.
Well, like you did before, you could just make it up.
Let's see. Billy Collins' "Forgetfulness." The name of the author is the first to go, and followed immediately by the plot, the title, the exciting conclusion, which then becomes a book you've never read before, never even heard of. As if, one by one, the memories that you used to harbor have decided to immigrate to the southern hemisphere of your brain, to a small island where there are no phones. Long ago you kissed the names of the 9 muses goodbye and watched the quadratic equation pack its bags. Even now, as you struggle to remember the order of the planets, something else is slipping away. The name of an uncle, address of a of a friend, the capital of Paraguay. And whatever it is that you're trying so desperately to remember, it's not perched at the tip of your tongue, nor is it lurking in some obscure corner of your spleen. It's floated away down a dark mythological river whose name begins with L, as near as you can recall. No wonder that you rise in the middle of the night to look up the name of a famous battle in a book on war. No wonder that the moon, perched outside of your window, seems to have drifted there from a love poem which you used to know by heart. Oh, apparently that wasn't as funny as I thought it was.
Well, we're laughing.
Well, I always have to explain that one, that illusion about Leith, the river Leith. Yeah, it's forgetfulness and the irony of, oh, you remembered that poem? Perhaps. I didn't butcher it as badly, Montfort people.
Well, we've talked about your interest in acting and teaching theater and all, but I also know that you happen to be a playwright, and maybe you can talk a little bit about your experience with that and the difference between being a playwright and being an actor, maybe. But I'm interested in what you've written and your history with the writing process.
Well, someone that I used to know in an artistic capacity recently caught up with me on that horrible thing of Facebook and asked me if I was still writing. And I explained the kinds of things that, I don't know, maybe you'll publish my memoir one of these days. The kinds of things that I do, the kinds of writing that I do right now, aren't primarily artistic. They're attempts to get students to clarify, attempts to get students to be more concise in their descriptions, or to hone that tool that they have in terms of their written language. And it's interesting to me that people don't see that as creative. That they think of creative writing as, oh, well, it's just got to be poetry or plays. And I think that the kind of nonfiction writing that I do with my students is every bit as, if not more, creative, in the sense that it's a smaller audience, but because of the size of that audience, I have to be that much more precise in the way that I approach them. Not to dodge the question entirely, because I do have, reams of stuff written. And the difference between being a playwright and being an actor, I wish we had Travis on here. Travis Lowe, actor friend of mine, that does a much better Richard, actually knows all the words, and has recently had a number of his plays produced there in Asheville. When we've talked about this, one of the really important facets of the difference between just writing to perform and memorizing what someone else has written to perform comes in those gaps, those spaces in between the words. You write a play expecting that, well, like I did with Billy Collins, this is going to be the funny part. And then you start, as you workshop it, you start discovering that the audience doesn't see that as funny, that they see that as this maudlin moment that is right there in between something that you said that was just funny and something that to them struck them as brilliant or as more directed toward them in terms of, you need to think about this. So for me, the best thing about writing plays and acting in them is that collaborative process, first between you and the playwright. And people think, you can't do that with Shakespeare, but you can, especially in terms of having a director that wants you to play it a particular way, and you having your own vision of how you think that line should be said. This is a collaborative process. And as a playwright, as a poet, if you've got an audience in your head, but you don't actually have that audience until it gets produced or until you read it in front of someone. And as a playwright, that's constantly at the forefront. You're always thinking, how is this going to be received? Whereas as a poet, it's like, well, I really like this line. I don't care if they like it or not. And I don't mean to belittle that that, or make it sound like as if that's any less of a kind of writing. But it's just, as a poet, that voice in your head can be enough. And it's just I want to express this, I'm trying to express this, and if the audience doesn't get it, the audience doesn't get it. Right. But as a playwright,
so you
can only do that once or twice if the audience didn't get it.
So you've got to be thinking about your audience when you're writing for theater, as opposed to poetry, which is you're really writing for yourself. You're not normally. I mean, maybe some people do, but I think, in my own experience, when I'm writing poetry, I don't write for an audience or any particular audience. I'm just writing it for myself, and if somebody out there happens to get it or like it, then great. But that's not what's at the forefront of your mind. I know I've worked with agents in terms of writing prose, novels and things that I've written, short stories, and they're always saying, what is your audience? Who are you writing this towards? And and that's very hard for someone to be handcuffed almost, having to write for a particular audience, or even thinking about a particular audience while they're writing something that they think is organic and creative. So, and you're writing for theater. I mean, you're having to think about audience, right? I mean, because you're having to think about how the actors are going to interpret what you're writing.
I think the distinction there is that as a poet, you're still writing for an audience, but you can have expectations for that audience that are a lot different from when you're writing for the stage. See, your expectations, you know that people that go to read poetry or listen to poetry have already got a more refined sense of the word than people necessarily that would come to see a play would. And when they come to see a play, they expect to see that blending of action, and they want to see physical movement, and the voice is important. It's always really important, especially in terms of Shakespeare, because I remember reading, I think it was in Lithgow, where he wrote in his memoir about drama, that he had a teacher that just said, just say the words, just get them out there. And as a poet, you can expect that your audience is going to have, maybe refines the wrong word here, but your audience is going to have a more concrete sense of poetry does these things. But with an audience in theater, you can't always make those assumptions about them, that they're going to get your little inside vocal jokes, or that's even worthwhile in terms of the audience that's come to see that. They want to see, go back to Aristotle, they want to see conflict. They want to see dialogue between characters. They want to see certain things that a reader or a listener to poetry doesn't necessarily want. So it isn't that you aren't writing for an audience. It may be in your case that you're writing for an audience of a bunch of Thomas Rain Crowes, but you're still writing for that attempt to say, I've got this thought that's crystallized here, and now I want you to see if you can get the same thing or anything from it. Right. And when you do that for theater, you're participating in the same process, but what you're eventually hoping for is a different, more visceral response to it. You want that belly laugh, or you want them to really just have that moment when they walk out of the theater crying. Whereas in poetry, it's a lot more cerebral in the sense that you want them to think about it. You want them to keep thinking about it.
Right. So you're not writing for performance. I mean, that's what I would say as a person who writes poetry. When I'm writing a poem, I'm not thinking about performance. I'm thinking about the words on the page and how they work on the page and in my mind more than in terms of performance. But I know that you've recently submitted a play for acceptance and performance at the Magnetic Theater in Nashville. And maybe can you tell us what that play is and what it's about, and maybe some history or background about that?
No. Okay. Just next question. I will. I'm just kidding. Where's the crickets? Cue the crickets. Actually, I'll come back to that.
Okay.
Because one of the things that I learned when I wrote this play was about those aspects of production. Mm-hmm. As I wrote this almost like a poem, I had this vision of how this play was going to be produced. It was completely impossible. I had all these ideas about mirrors and puppets and all of these crazy things to try to make it like it was inside this person's mind. Mm-hmm. But it was a dialogue between characters, and it was a dialogue we're all familiar with. It was a husband and a wife, and they were arguing again, and they were arguing about something that they'd argued about before. But what I wanted to illustrate with those puppets was that they weren't arguing just by themselves. And so there were like these generations of people behind them that were manipulating them. And so you've been in that argument and you said, that's your mother talking.
Ah.
Well, that's what I was trying to illustrate.
Right.
And that was the wrong way to try to do it.
Well, it may not have been a wrong way. It's just that the people that were reading it didn't understand it. Again, way too many thank yous here, but Stephen Samuels, was the director, the artistic director of the Mad Mimic Theater at the time, and he was exceptionally good in terms of reading this and telling me, this is a great play in these ways. This is an impossible to produce play in these ways. Yeah. So that what I learned from that, and what I eventually, I think it is making the writing that I do stronger now, is what we were just talking about in terms of a cerebral idea and how to get that across. Again, this will live in infamy for me, but if I wouldn't have butchered Richard so badly, I would have gone back to some of the ideas about how physical things can embody or symbolize mental things. And I didn't do a very good job of that in my Richard soliloquy or in that play, in the sense that I tried to make everything so much more visual and didn't rely on the dialogue. I didn't rely on people hearing that and being able to come up with the imagery that they needed at that point. So where I came from, well, again, as I said, this play was concerned primarily with the discussion between these people, but what I wanted to show was that that this discussion, although it seemed like it was taking place in a vacuum between this married couple, wasn't, and that it never does. That we're never completely alone in that sense, and that we are always mimicking and imitating voices that we've heard from our past, and that the trick for us is to become better listeners and to be able to discern what is this person saying and what is their background saying. What is this person trying to communicate to me, and in our own individual situation, as opposed to what are they just repeating that they've always repeated before? And am I a good enough listener to actually discern that, or am I just waiting for my turn to talk? Right. So are you in the process, after this experience with the Magnetic Theater and what you just described for us now, about your realization of maybe some of the things that you might change, are you rewriting the play, revising it at all, or have you moved on to something different?
I will go to that eventually. One of the most difficult things to teach to my students is the revision process, to actually see it as revision, to think of it in terms of seeing it again differently from different eyes. So I had to put it away. I got to put it away and not go back to it for a while and just let it sit. So in the process, though, I started writing another play that I thought would still communicate similar ideas, but would not be so abstract. That would actually have something that people could get a grip on and understand this at a literal level before I started getting all figurative and symbolic on that.
Right. Well, you just led right into my next question, was what are you working on now? So can you tell us a little bit more about this project?
Yeah, it was inspired by something that we all, I'm sure, are familiar with, and that is people mishearing song lyrics. When I was in college, there was a guy who told me that excuse me while I kiss the sky actually was excuse me while I kiss the sky.
Guy.
Oh, you heard that one too?
Oh, yes. I grew up in the 60s. Jimi Hendrix. It's Jimi Hendrix, yes.
and this young lady that told me very earnestly, oh, I'm not going to listen to that Blue Oyster Cult song. That's about drug use. Don't fear the reefer. No, dear, that's Don't Fear the Reaper. That's about someone not being afraid of death. So what I wanted to have was, again, it always comes from somewhere inside of us, and my grandmother had early onset Alzheimer's, and people close to her tried to take care of her, and while they were trying to take care of her, she didn't know that. So the whole time she was just remembering all these other things from her past and arguing with them and feeling like those feelings of paranoia, those people were out to get her when they weren't. They were doing their best they could to take care of her. So again, it's one of those abstract ideas of the people that help us most, we don't realize that they're helping us. Mm-hmm. So I'm having it take place, past tense. So I'm working on this. Mm-hmm. I was trying to have it take place in a home for elderly people that were succumbing to early onset Alzheimer's. And so it's the same idea of those misheard song lyrics, but the characters they'll say things that the people that work there don't understand because they don't have a knowledge of what happened in their background. But then, of course, I'll have it lit on the side so that the things that are in those characters' memories will come up as different scenes on the side so that we'll have that dramatic irony of we'll understand what's going on because we'll know what's going on in that elderly person's head, but the people working there won't know because they'll pretend that they don't see those things happening in the wings, as it were.
Yeah, you could really morph this whole thing into a comedy very easily, I would think. I mean...
What?
No, just the whole idea of misunderstanding the song lyrics. The examples that you just gave, you could make a whole theater piece just from that alone.
Sure.
But will you work some of the more comedic effects into the play?
It actually would be, here again, it's probably something from my past that has me short-circuiting myself here, but it actually would be a lot more... it would be easier to sell to producers, and it would be better for audiences if it were comedic instead of it being tragic. Right. That it would show a better understanding of who the people are that go to see plays now. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it probably should be a lot funnier than the way I've written it. Thanks for that revision note there, Thomas.
I'll send you my invoice.
Well, especially in terms of art, there's a really fine line between the tragic and the comic anyway. I mean, I forget who said it. I'm not supposed to admit that either, but was it Marx that said? No, of course it wasn't. It was Sartre. No. That things happen, and when they happen at first, they happen as tragedy, and then they get repeated as comedy. And that, what we end up doing is we try to take control of the tragic by making it funny. Mm-hmm. And so it is, just one of those methods that we have of trying to get control of the situation is to see the humor in it. And it does, it makes it a lot more palatable. makes it a lot easier for us to deal with. Don't fear the reaper.
Yeah.
If we throw something funny in there.
There you go. You got your line.
I don't know if I can use that as the title. Are we violating any copyright laws?
Yeah. What is the title you're working on with that play? Or do you have one yet?
It's still got a working title. The song that inspired it for me was a song by Pearl Jam called Yellow Ledbetter, which the first time I heard it, I had no idea what any of the lyrics were. So what I initially called it was by my grandmother's name. I called it Madeline Huff.
That's interesting. It's homage to your grandmother. What advice would you give to young people who are interested in theater and acting? I mean,
don't. No, that's not true. Oh, God, there it goes with the comedy again.
see?
It's timing. It's all timing. No, I especially in those classes, I do that all the time. I've got a number of people right now who would like to make a career of it. I like to think that I would have. I always tell them I would have made a career of it, but I like to eat too much, as you can tell. I thought the camera was supposed to be slimming. It's a really, really tough industry. One of my good friends at Montfort there, Trinity. Thanks, Trinity. She's not going to see this. I'm not going to tell her about that because she'll give me a hard time about Richard III. No, she said that the most difficult thing about acting is that you're interviewing for the same job hundreds of times. Everybody else just goes out and they interview for a job 2-3 times in their lifetime. In acting, you're constantly interviewing for your job. It doesn't matter what you've done before, you're going to go out there and they're not going to care. Oh yeah, I got that list, I got my resume, I throw it out there in front of them. Oh, you've done this Shakespeare. I don't care. What do you got for me now? Right? So in terms of acting, I said, you have to develop a thick skin. You have to be able to take constructive criticism, but then you have to be able to sort through that and decide what's constructive. What's the criticism that's going to be useful to you at that point? I like to think with a lot of theater that's a lesson for life, and it is in a sense because you're almost always in that same kind of give and take with the people that you work with and for, but it's never with that kind of pressure of, if I don't pull this off, I don't get this job.
Right.
Yeah, and so I don't, I would never say, don't do that. So I tell them, pursue this as a career, but if you do, be aware of all of the things that we work on in terms of distinguishing between method acting and original practice Shakespeare production and using the Alexander technique. All of that, they don't care about. They care about the way you look and if you fit within the particular pattern that they're looking to cast. And so you can't take it personally when you don't get cast as that. What you have to do then is just shuck it off and go and do it again. And I'm terrible at that. So, I guess that's why I'm not a professional actor. Then I forget lines to Richard III.
It's the same way with writing. I mean, you have to have I tell young people, I say you have to have a thick skin and you have to be persistent. Those two things. And if you can master those two things, you'll have at least a ballpark chance of getting your work published and maybe even gaining a reputation of sorts over time. But
this is the kind of advice we would give to everybody. Work at your craft. Understand what it is that you're trying to do and work to get better at it. Take those tools that you have and sharpen them. But in terms of acting or writing, you can't always base your perception of yourself on the last immediate audience reaction that you had. And you can't just become morose because you didn't get that part. And you also can't become elated because, wow, you get to do that part. Now you still have to do that part. Now you still have to do the homework. Now you still have to hone your craft. I know that's, and it's tough to tell younger people that. I mean, best way to put this. I know Plato was probably the first person, if not the first, close to say, these kids today. So I'm a historical relativist in that sense, you know, and I know that young people now really in some ways aren't any different from young people in ancient Greece. You know, they're feeling their wild oats. You know? But at the same time, we live in a culture now that is the speed of light, not faster. And we live in a culture that doesn't reward or give accolades to work ethic or determination or resilience. You know, all these things that people of our generation, okay, I know we're different generations, but all these things that we thought were so important don't really get repeated as often now. And so, you know it's still there. You know they still have those characteristics and those talents and that humor. But they don't see that. You know, I mean, I know I'd get all kinds of grief if anybody were watching this. George and Ethel, kids love YouTube. I hate that. There's no, you know, people just post stuff. And then they want to tell you, oh, but that's democratic. Well, not really. Just because all of us can do it doesn't mean that it's equal. You know, it doesn't mean that that film has any more aesthetic appeal than this one does. They just get put up there. And I appreciate the idea. Oh, am I going on too long?
No.
I just get the sense every once in a while.
No, we're good.
They, you know, again, I don't mean this as a critique of an entire younger generation, but I do see that, especially with phones now, their attention spans are shrinking. You know, I mean, and maybe it's not physical, maybe it is just something emotional and affective, and maybe I'm the dinosaur in that respect. We always make the joke about Logan's Run. Anybody Logan's Run? People, black diamonds on our hands. There was a film in the 70s about these people, they killed all people after they got over 30. And so you had this little diamond in your hand, and it would turn black when you were 30. And so Logan's Run were the people that were all running away, trying to get away from getting killed. So that's kind of the reputation that I have at the school there, of having the black diamonds in my hand among my younger colleagues. And I, you know, I think I still have enough energy, and I think I still feel enough empathy for younger people to recognize that, you know, I'm not just being an old curmudgeonly dinosaur and telling them, you need to hone your craft. You need to get better at what you do. And, you know, and they think that when I start talking about phones and shrinking attention spans, but I make them memorize poems, and then I see all these arguments against rote memorization that don't continue the argument. You know, they just say, well, we shouldn't have to just memorize things. Yeah, if that's all you're doing, you shouldn't just have to memorize things. But that's one level that you have to start with. And you can't progress to those other levels in the hierarchy if you can't remember things. And I do run into the ones that can't remember things. Sorry.
No. That's...
You're going to bury this somewhere.
Well, that kind of leads me to another question. Have you done any film work? I mean, we talked about theater, but if you had a film experience, and how different is film from theater?
I have done some film. There was a film they shot here, I can't remember exactly, back 2010, maybe 2011, called Road to Nowhere.
Yeah.
I actually got on Road to Nowhere. I didn't butcher my Richard III speeches badly then. No, I was just, my son went to the School of the Arts, my son Quentin, went to the School of the Arts, and he was working as a PA, an assistant on the film, and they said they needed extras. So I went up there as an extra, and then a bunch of extras were just sitting around, and I got up on the picnic table and started reciting Richard III, and the director walked by and said, "Hey, let's get him in this." So I got in it, but I don't have any speaking lines, and so I'm in Road to Nowhere, and one of the things that you learn when those students ask me, "Do you want to, what would I do to become an actor?" I say the first thing you got to do is act on the stage, because the pressure's a lot more and you have to get it right the first time. And the other reason that you need to do that is you have to be able to sit for hours on a film set and not do anything. And then suddenly you're going to shoot this shot and you're going to shoot it 25 times. And so the finished product that they see, it gives that impression of being of the moment. But it's not. And so what I always try to get them to do first is look at some of your favorite actors and see how many of them started on the stage. Go get started on the stage. Can't make any money. Okay, go to movie and film. But know that there's a really different process involved in that. If you memorize your lines, then you can work in terms of intonation. And you can make it sound fresh. On the stage, you have to do that. You have to reproduce that at that moment. In the film, you got 25 shots.
It doesn't sound like a lot of fun, that sitting around just 25 shots.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make it sound that badly. And I was in, as I said, my son directed, he was in the director's track at School of the Arts in Winston-Salem, and his senior film, I get to play a homeless drifter in that one. Yeah, that was fun. That's the extent of my film work, though. But again, what it came down to was, you guys sit over here and wait. It was a lot like my Army experience. Hurry up and wait. You guys get over here. We're going to come get you. We haven't forgotten about you. We'll come back and get you. Okay, we got you. Quick, move over here. Do it while the light's right. It's the golden hour. We got to shoot now.
Okay. Well, I think this is the perfect time for our audition. So we're going to pretend that we're having an audition, and you're auditioning for the part. And in this particular case, we're going to have you recite The Raven. Maybe not the whole poem. It's a long poem, but just a piece of The Raven, and
okay.
We'll let
We're going to go out on that. You're going to trail out, and then the credits will come down.
And there's going to be music and everything. And the animals will come out of the woods back here behind us. And
well, I'll be happy to do that then. Yeah. I do The Raven almost every year around Halloween, even though the setting is December. But we'll get to that.
Yeah, well, the timing's good then.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone were gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, rapping at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing. Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly had I sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore, nameless here. Evermore. And the silken, sad, and certain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now to still the beating of my heart I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more. Back into my chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon again I heard a rapping, but somewhat louder than before. Surely, said I, that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let me still the beating of my heart a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more. Open here I flung the shutter, and with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven, from the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance gave he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door. Perched upon a bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door. Perched, and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest is shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly, grim, and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on this night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though his answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ere yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door. Bird or beast on sculptured bust above his chamber door with such a name as nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if in that one word his soul he did outpour. Nothing further then he uttered, not a feather then he fluttered, until I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. But then the bird said, nevermore.
And on that note, you've done a proud version. Edgar Allan Poe would be very proud of you.
And he's not rolling in his grave.
And we're all very proud of you as a teacher and as an actor and as a member of our community. And we want to thank you for coming in this morning and sharing your life and experiences and your thoughts and your talents with us here on the Culture Hour, Mountain Stream TV. I hope all of you will join us again next week at this time for another version and another edition of the Culture Hour with someone in the arts here in Western North Carolina to share with us their life and journey along the path through the woods. You can check in with Mountain Stream TV online. Just go to mountainstream.tv on the internet, and you'll find all the different conversations we've had with various artists in our community. And we thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.